Right. Well, I definitely want to take the whole terms of the debate into what was in the bottom of the list there in terms of the big questions. And I mean, the big questions come back to a discussion about people, places, and how we connect them. And so I want to start. So why are we actually here now at the OECD and discussing this issue? And it's been really interesting for me. I think back 25 years ago, being told by numerous people, this will never come to anything. And we've seen nothing but 25 years of more interest in accessibility indicators, and at the same time, less and less emphasis on traditional transport indicators. So the direction of travel is clear. So I choose a sort of quote from a sort of popular novel, global bestseller. Nothing academic about it. Basically, if you speak Dutch, obviously you could have read it in 2014, but the English version this summer, and basically saying, let's think about the indicators that OECD might use today, like GDP, and what does GDP look around the planet, and say, well, that was an indicator for its time. But what I mean, I think it was about a month or two back, there was a McKinsey article where somebody was arguing if we only measured one thing today, it would be access to opportunity, because the role of government has shifted from creating wealth to distributing wealth, and hierarchy to networks. There are big things going on in the economy, and all of these lead to a different type of way of measuring what we do, and particularly looking at how we use time, and the time that is wasted within the economy, you know, sitting in queues or whatever it happens to be. But there are loads of market failures. So that's the focus. It's very much in the big questions arena, Tom, when you're chairing. You know, let me sort of cast this within. You know, I like the sort of social model of how we do things. I mean, you know, if you think in terms of hierarchies, individuals, and communities, you know, things happen because somebody tells you to, the hierarchy approach, individuals because you want to, or because other people are doing it. And pretty much everything that happens for one of these three reasons. So if you're into organizational theory and things like this, you'll be very familiar with social model. Hopefully all of you here are. So for example, if you have a large company, that company at the hierarchy level will negotiate with its staff and say, will you turn up for work if we pay you this much money? So you negotiate what's valued. That similarly, the staff would have a negotiation. Potentially, you would have a collective staff association or whatever, community-based, what's acceptable within that environment. And collectively, we have an ability to organise society, whatever that society is. And what we have here is an issue. You know, why are we talking about accessibility? Well, I mean, so I came into this because in 1992, the Rio Summit had concluded that the big problem with transport was it was looking at transport and not looking at accessibility. And so we need to think about the big changes that society is facing and why we need to move. The problem was transport does not resolve socially. I mean, if we look at the street outside here today, what we find is if we try and resolve transport socially within transport, or we're going to have more bikes, we just end up creating social divisions because we don't have a metric to prioritise whether or not it's more important somebody cycles or drives or walks or whatever. We need a metric outside transport in order to say who gets priority for that road space, and that metric is accessibility. So this is why are we talking about this? I think is my starting point, and we're talking about this because transport does not resolve socially. The fundamental problem that transport it was interesting that, you know, I like the people that tell me I'm talking a load of rubbish. And you know, Malcolm Buchanan, a consultant in London back in the early 90s, said, forget it. You're getting absolutely nowhere with this. You know, you're going absolutely nowhere. You're talking rubbish. Really nice. He came back to me 20 years later and said, I'm really glad you completely ignored everything I told you. So, you know, you know, what I'm saying is the direction of travel is clear, and to resolve transport socially, we need to. Can I just At the bottom of the slides, if you want further reading on any of this, I don't publish academic papers. Sometimes stuff I've done at conference stuff does get published in academic journals. But because of the incentive structure, incentives, the way things work, the business model I'm on doesn't incentivize published papers at all. The business model is about publishing reports. So there's one there, access, information, and flexibility, which is looking at the future of transport. It was actually done as part of a series about the future of the world, basically, for a group of about 20 of us dealing with every aspect of finance and the economy. And a fascinating series looking back and arguably the most important research resource if you wanted to see what could have happened, the evidence on the banking crash. And part of my report was saying, well, the biggest impact on transport will be the banking crash. And lots of people looked around and said, we didn't know about this. But why didn't they know about it? Because the information was not resolving within the political circles that needed that evidence available to them to know what was going on in the economy. So, measuring what's valued, organising solutions and incentives for policy goals. I think indicators are needed in all three of these areas, and I think OECD could do something extremely valuable in every single one of these. The incentives for the policy goals we often underpin, like, for example, profit would be a very strong incentive for many private companies, and we'd use that as an indicator of are we succeeding or not. But in accessibility, our incentives are different. They're much more social, and how do we decide with that? And the organising one, far too few accessibility indicators are currently about how good we are at organising things. Very important element there too. So, to crack on, the resolving process, where have we got to? Now, again, if people say accessibility doesn't resolve, then the question I would ask is, why does pretty much every commercial organisation depend more on accessibility indicators than almost any other type of indicator? So if you look, when we first mapped access by car across the UK, basically we found the most accessible locations were where the IKEA stores were, within a few metres. So we thought, someone's been here first. and the thing is, we look at why they've been successful as a company over the last 25 years, because they were analysing accessibility. It resolved for them in a way that was commercially successful. But they're not as a company commissioned to be socially and resolve what they do socially. That's for the public authorities. And indeed, there's a lot to talk about, should we make accessibility mandatory? It is. It's absolutely mandatory in virtually every country in the world. In the UK, we've got very strict legislation about accessibility. If you're, say, a health authority, how you ensure that it's equitable and efficient. We've got strict legislation around education. A whole range of access is written from top to bottom of our legislative process. But the problem is, nobody actually enforces it. We don't actually succeed in organising those solutions very well. And so if the green box is the accessibility planner, let's say, trying to connect this up. Yes, firms like mine, we're busy working for commercial sector and others, helping them deliver good access, and that all works. But what we're finding is the dotted lines, the stuff that's quite variable in quality across the country and across authorities, are the ability of, say, a transport authority in England to say to the health authority, do you realise if you move that hospital to there, that won't be very equitable because some of your clients won't get there? The health authority, they're not thinking about access. They're not experts in access. They're thinking about health. We're meant to be the experts, the transport people, and we're meant to be pointing that out to our health authority. So the question of how accessibility resolves is absolutely the fundamental issue. It resolves through the way that a health authority will spend its budget differently, and I think that would be my so we can look at it from the perspective of how do we resolve our own budget, as Simon's explained very well. Transport authorities need to think about our own catchment for transport. What's the catchment that walk into our what we call connectivity, the ports, the airports, rights. We do need to think about our own customers, but we also need to think about other people's customers too, because no one else is doing that in the economy. Transport, just as we provide road and rail and bus networks, we also need to provide the organisational networks that allow access to opportunity to thrive within a society. And that's the sort of core thesis of what I think was coming out of the Rio Summit, and 25 years on is now mainstream thinking, with bloggers writing something, probably as I speak today, about access to opportunities, what every government around the world need to do. Now, so what I was saying, sitting here in OECD, I mean, issues like efficiency and competitiveness, are these not issues that are core and would resolve completely if the OECD was publishing information about efficiency and competitiveness globally? How would we do that? What would those indicators be? So that's the sort of concept of. Now down to some of the practical stuff about, so what have we done to try and make this concept of accessibility resolve at a UK level? And probably the biggest programme that was launched, that sort of came through the political process, all post-Rio. I mean, if you look at the sort of Rio stuff, how all the political manifestos post that, and the 5 years after that, built up to a 1997 general election in the UK, and all the political parties were talking about how they were going to implement Local Agenda 21 as it was at that point, and this sort of thing. So it happened that the Labour government got in with very strong commitments to accessibility, and a process was set up. I'd strongly encourage anybody interested in this subject, if they've not read it, to read that bottom reference there, which is I'm only a couple of thousand page parliamentary inquiries. It's not a huge document, but it's really interesting, and watch some of the videos online and stuff like this. But what they did was they looked 10 years on at what had happened and had it worked. And what was so interesting was the conclusion that they came to was, it's almost like government's not done anything better than this in the last 10 years. But the Department for Transport seem a bit apathetic, while the Department for Work and Pensions are thrilled with what's been achieved. The Department for Health are thrilled with what's been achieved. And so what we found was, because the Department for Transport had gone along and said, how can we help you, that actually a whole lot of things are on. And I think if we actually did the research to look at the savings that central government in the UK has made as a result of accessibility planning, I think you would find they grossly exceeded the entire transport budget of 20 billion a year. Now, no research has been done on that, because no health journals are publishing stuff on access to health, because they talk about, did this patient care work? And no transport journals are publishing it. And this was one of the things they highlighted, is why are all the academics telling us this didn't work? And all the policymakers and the practitioners were saying this is the best thing we've ever done. So it was one of the things that the committee had to try and resolve, that the academic discourse in the UK was completely, far too narrow. It was looking at whether did accessibility planning resolve within transport, which the evidence is mixed. Like Simon's explained. I mean, it's mixed. What you do with PTALs in London, and does it resolve purely in that context? Does it resolve within other programmes? Absolutely. So, what did Department of Transport do? There's this whole process. You're probably familiar with that. I won't go into the details of how we set it. Department of Transport published a sort of statistics at a national level. I'll talk about them just in a little bit, because you'll be interested in the formulation of these. They're published in a standardised format by government, which is particular tables and particular spreadsheets at local super output area, at sort of neighbourhood level. Because that's really quite complicated for a lot of people to look at, we published them at accesstoservices.info, which was an interactive website. We could simply click on any zone of the UK if you were doing a housing application, and do use the drop-down menu to say access to GPs or whatever. Now, because there are now so many of these commercial services, we link mainly to them. Think of IGLEs or whatever, all out there, linked in now with the estate agents and the other embedded in the website. So there's now no longer a market failure, I would argue, in calculating these indicators. There is a failure in how we use them, and that's what where I think the real drivers of of government. The local indicators were about how the local authorities thought about issues about, is it too expensive, and how do we negotiate these changes, scheduling issues, information training, and all this sort of stuff. But, in the national level, we could say, is there a problem? What's the strategic assessment? We then prepare a plan, and what Department for Transport did was they looked at nationally, they looked at each plan prepared by a local authority in their local transport plan and said, here is the settlement we'll fund you on. Now that then changed because they decided that the transport authorities were too narrow in their perspective on accessibility, so they changed that funding to something called local enterprise partnerships, single outcome agreements in Scotland, and the negotiation between national and local government on how they deliver accessibility is through these brokerage mechanisms now. But Department for Transport, to recognise the special nature of accessibility, topped that up, and again in the parliamentary inquiry you can see here Norman Baker and officials from Department for Transport talking about how they're using local sustainable transport fund and the access fund to provide pump priming to help this process thrive. In other parts of the country, smarter travel funds are used, and this thing. So it varies where you're in Scotland, England, Wales, exactly the mechanism, but broadly the principle of a local authority preparing an accessibility and the way they're going to deliver that plan, how are we going to deliver it, what much money we need, how do we work with our partners, what are the issues involved, is then funded as a programme to deliver that. There's again, the academics in the UK, it sometimes seems to have been queuing up to say this doesn't resolve within transport and therefore it doesn't work, when actually evidence is quite to the contrary. I'd love to see some research actually debating, if some people argue it's to the contrary, would they review that evidence too? Because there is a mixed debate, and that's particularly around the funding issue. You may have heard what I think is completely incorrect. The Department of Transport no longer promote all of this. Quite the contrary, they've been expanding it, and particularly what we learned most with the early indicators, we weren't doing enough on access to transport. So an awful lot more, because there are a lot of other services that can be accessed through transport nodes. So if you look at motorway junctions, railway stations, ports, airports, they've all been added in the last 5 years. In the connectivity statistics, so to say that anything's been scaled back is so. Anyway, how are they calculated? At census output area level, the data is collected and the journey times from each measured through. There's actually over 150 indicators published in the series by the Department for Transport. Whole range of trip purposes, not all of them every year, and not all of them in every part of the country, but those are there, and say travel time is the main focus. Could be used as a proxy for costs, and I'll come back to that to explain why in a minute. In terms of the scale of that, there's about 100 households in a census output area, which is the level at which that calculation is done. So it's not individual house level. That was simply a function back in 2002. The computing power was not quite there to do that at an individual household level, but actually the Welsh did that. So the Welsh indicators are from each individual household to every destination, at each point destination. And so say we take work, for example, we take where every job is located, a data set that's broadly available. We take where every house address is located at every location, and we aggregate them all up. And both those are statements of fact, not complex. Whether it takes the computer an extra half an hour to remember, nowadays we'd resolve that in Britain in, say, an analysis would happen just in real time. The computing now, it wasn't like that in 2002, but we could still do it at a 100 household level, even back then. So there's, for me, there's no reason, and again, we'll come back to the sort of data partnerships that we need to do in order to do that, because, if you look at the fact that you can put in any address point in the world pretty much now into Google and get any other address point, and actually that Google also have where every other job is, this data is out there, so all you actually need to do is broker the agreements with those that have the data. When we were doing the work on the retail side, companies like Experian, huge data sets that they make available to us, so it's about how we do the partnerships, because sadly at the minute, if we go along, say, on the road speed data and say we'd like to buy companies like Here Maps or in RICS want to charge us six-figure sums. They're completely excluding the likes of us round the table from doing that sort of analysis. So it's really important that the overseeing bodies, the public authorities and bodies like the OECD, try and deliver the partnerships that can then enable stuff for everybody else. So anyway, probably enough about the indicators, and again I want to race through because I was going to say a bit more about, we kind of talked about all of this in discussion. It's really important to recognise that most of the sensitivity to change is where the service at the destinations are, and it's not, as Simon said, transport's not that sensitive at all, but that's really what's important. Transport is a derived demand, and therefore because transport is a derived demand, if we want to influence how much travel there is on the road, then basically the way we influence how much travel there is on the road by influencing the people that generate it, the health authorities or whatever. So actually, that's how we actually resolve the issue of travel demand management, is through accessibility planning, which is indeed what the government policies say and how they frame accessibility as a goal. So we invest in capabilities. Who's got the money? And the money does not lie, on the whole, with the transport sector, the public bodies. It does lie with consumers, though. Last time I crunched the numbers, 97% of transport spending in the UK was private, individuals and companies. We're not going to change transport by the way we spend the public budget. we're going to change transport by the way we change the 97%, and that's what this is about, how we engage with others. So recognise that all accessibility measures are context specific. So there's so many variables that can be measured, so many that could be ignored. There is no chance you will ever have what an objective accessibility measure is. Just not the point. It never resolves in that type of way. How it resolves objectively is because you have an objective, and that objective is negotiated with the health authority or with the education authority, and you agree what your shared goal is and how you're going to measure that success and incentivize it and build a business model around it. So that's my core proposition. Again, Karst's typologies probably covered a lot of that. So how do we grow the access economy? And which is actually what we're talking about. How do we, instead of having a transport economy where we only value, you're only given a value if you're in a motorised vehicle. Transport only resolves financially if you buy fuel or cars or bikes or anything. The only way we get any money back is it only resolves within transport if it's really motorised modes. So walking, the most abundant mode, is pretty much not valued. Derisory budgets, we never create attractive walking spaces. So actually creating business models in the value of abundance, which is perfectly within our power. We can manage that type of business model, just as we've seen with waste management. We've taken valueless commodities and turned them round and created whole new markets in them with circular economy thinking, a loop connection, as I like to put it in transport terms. The focus of government and wealth distribution and social models of delivery. So couple, before I wrap up, of case studies. I say there's a paper that did make it from a conference paper I did on case studies and accessibility planning. Includes some of these, but the land use case study. What does the business model look like? Well, very often it's what does it cost? The one in the top right. What does it cost to deliver no net detriment to access? It's a very clear thing. You can tell that housing developer, right? Okay, the best locations. This is Durham, and piece of work we did there. This is Durham. You want to build the housing in the outskirts of Durham. Well, that's fine, but the best locations near to the railway station are used up. So what do we need to invest in order to deliver no net detriment? Quantifiable, manageable, understandable, defendable legally, all of the things that we're talking about that we need to do, and those processes. And one of the, that table there comes from Department for Environment, Transport and the Regions, the old Department for Transport 1995 guidance on the sorts of ratios that you should be looking at, and below about 2.5 of the car accessibility to non-car accessibility, you will start to see very significant public transport use or non-car use. So therefore, it's those locations. What do you need to do to get the ratio of car to non-car down below 2.5? So there's then Another successful area has been the sort of enabling the lobby groups. Now, Forum for the Future had a highly successful series around transport for a while, and Sustainable Cities Index. Indeed, I was getting phone calls and saying, why have we gone from, from 14th place in transport down the league tables? Huge incentive there by enabling the lobby bodies that people trust to publish indicators, and Countryside Agency, again, they published the State of the Countryside report for the rural accessibility issues, and again, huge interest in those issues. I mean, it's actually when the new Conservative government came in the UK, and there was question they were wanting to get rid of government bureaucracy and lots of things like this. What was interesting was they dumped the index of multiple deprivation as a statistic and said, no, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to save money on this useless statistic. But they kept the accessibility statistics. Now, I think that's really interesting, and Diego was telling me that's still the intention to carry on, that series still continues despite all the other cutbacks that go on within government. So, State of the part of that came from the Commission for Rural Communities, basically saying, we couldn't live without this indicator. And actually, many of them were the Tory constituencies in the UK. And so actually, the Tory ministers listened to that. And so although we'll talk a lot in transport about urban areas, don't neglect all parts of society too, because it can come back and resolve politically for you in your favour. So I'm going to talk about a piece of work very quickly that just illustrates some of this. Over the last 10, 12 years, no, probably more than that now, we've been helping the Department for Health with their operational policy for access to pharmacies. How much money do they spend, and trying to deal with that training. This year compared to last year, the Department for Health is spending £200 million, €200 million less on supporting pharmacies while protecting access for everybody to pharmacies. That means that's more money to spend in the health budget. None of that comes back to DFT, but actually DFT set up and facilitated the entire process. And I'd be saying, that's pretty bad deal making for me. But anyway, that's another issue. But we've done this across all sorts of sectors. If you look at access to it, the employability benefits have been massive. Say some of the stuff around hospitals, this sort of thing. So you look at this, I say, just by being clear about who's accountable and how you help the who's paying for access to deliver their goals. And it's what are our indicators, and we can come back to some of the stuff in guys. There's a lot of talk about willingness to pay in transport, far too little in the bottom line there about willingness to accept. Now remember that willingness to pay, yes, is a necessary but not sufficient condition, and so is willingness to accept, a necessary but not sufficient condition. So we need to ensure not. So even if we get both of them, we've still not got there. We need to think about the whole system, the times, the costs, the distances, the physical safety, all the things that are there. If we want to have an accessibility indicator that resolves for individuals, we need to ensure all of these issues. So where does that data come from, and how do we do that? Well, I mentioned yesterday very briefly some of the stuff about how we do this through platforms. We started with the accessibility planning pilots in Wigan in 2003, and I've been working there pretty much since, on a whole range of issues. So, for example, a further education college student. This would be a 16 to 19-year-old. Will they have a life of worklessness if they failed at school, or will they have a life of work? Fairly important time to get right, and yet what happens is often the bus wasn't turning up. So basically, when the bus doesn't turn up, I just go home, and they don't bother going to college, they drop out, etc. So how do we deal with that issue? And we dealt with that issue by managing it through smart communications. Text your phone, text this number to the taxi company, get your lift, get your ride. So effectively, they're left standing at the bus stop, but there's no excuse for not being there. So suddenly this, I didn't make it on Tuesday because the bus didn't come, gone as an excuse. We've managed accessibility, we've organised a solution, and people have a life of work rather than a life of work premises. Now, if you look at these effects, what would really happened in Newcastle or Mersey travel with this is what Department for Work and Pensions were talking about to the parliamentary inquiry, saying this has been revolutionary for us. On the health side, we similarly, instead of hierarchy, the old hierarchy stuff, here is the appointment you will get to go to hospital. It was actually through the accessibility plans that we first had booked appointments at hospital, where people could say, oh, I can get a lift at X time, or I can travel because there's a bus that runs at that time. So people would start to book their appointments at hospital. So again, something Department for Transport facilitated, but I got no financial benefit back from, was all the stuff that now goes on. It's now routine practice that health authorities will have platforms, booking platforms where people can organise their appointments and get to hospital at a time. All of this managed that we can do through a personal account, where that depends on how's your transport paid for, if it's transport's being reimbursed, if we're asking you to go further. Then all of this resolves, and we can use incentives in a whole new way. I mean, so these platforms are all over the place, usually branded and delivered locally, which I'm passionate about, trying to build these local platforms, because I'm a wee bit scared that the only people developing the powerful platforms could be Amazon and Google. We don't need, we have the technologies. Why don't we secure this locally within our towns and go and do all this stuff? Just some examples. I mean, but the sort of on the negative side, what we've had was the Wigan platform that we had was closed down because Transport for Greater Manchester said this is a competitor with our platform. We're the hierarchy here. So now there's echoes there of Transport for London's debates with Uber. Who controls the taxi? Who's the power broker? And what I'm saying is the biggest casualty in delivering this collaborative approach to transport, which is what this really is all about, how we collaborate to do things better, has been actually the defense of power. and this is what's changing. And actually, if you read the blogs and what they're saying the way we're going to deliver access to opportunity is through alternative currencies and all sorts of alternatives, just bypass money. And so we see the rise of the cryptocurrency. So Henry wants to do research proposals around this, and the way that we may see the whole development of alternative models of trust, because we can no longer trust public authorities. That's an interesting space to be in. Do people need them? Well, they absolutely should not. Our public authorities absolutely should be able to do all of this sort of stuff. But if they're going to fight off the platforms that can succeed locally, until such time as the only people you can't fight off are too big to fail, like Uber, then basically you will end up with horrible monsters, bully boys, as the only people that will succeed in the space of reforming transport. So this is where I stand. This is where the connections we're trying to do, and how do we expand all of this? We'll start by measuring what's valued, building the business models around that with incentives for success, penalties for failure. We can do all of that, all fairly easy. Look at the indicators that we've got. And how do we develop trust? That trust, I genuinely believe, must come from the public authorities. It's about democracy. But sadly, what we're seeing, and we've seen reflections of this in Britain, is trust in public authorities is collapsing. And people want more trust back in public authorities. It's one amongst the biggest issues we face in society. And accessibility is right at the heart, I think. If we say to people, here's how we can deliver you access to opportunity, then we actually can build that trust back in public authorities. And OECD, I believe, can be a very hard role in the way that I highlighted the voluntary sector, like Forum for the Future. Publishing these indicators has been hugely successful, creating a bit of competition. Why is your access going down? And I think we could do it with the available data from every household to every job. I think we probably need a couple of indicators like access to population, access to work, like Simon's been using in London. Keep it simple. We don't need too many trip purposes, because actually if we aggregate trip purposes, as Amy and her team are proposing at the minute, we can come back to this later, it doesn't then resolve with any of the individual sectors, and by not resolving with any of the individual sectors, you lose the power of accessibility indicators. So that's me.